What's up, guys? In this video today I'm going to be talking about piston speed and what piston speed means to your engine and your belt. I've been getting, I do a lot of cylinder heads now, and when people call me and say they need a cylinder head built, I have a few questions for them, like what are they using the build for? Are you using it, a couple applications would be a boat, which is a torque motor, or say a go-kart, track racing go-kart, which is, you're accelerating, you're braking, your long speed straights, which is a mid-range, type of engine, mid to high. And then you have stuff like drag bikes, which I've been getting a lot of people calling me on lately, is mini bike drag engines. Who doesn't want a mini bike drag engine? But they'll be asking me questions about, I want this mini bike drag engine, which is an all-out, race engine. This is just an engine designed to operate at one throttle position, wide open throttle. You hold it at wide open throttle until it reaches its maximum RPM, its maximum power, and then you're just off the power, and you're basically shutting it back down. So that's really its only power ranges. It lives there. Now, when you're building an engine that only lives at full throttle, and you're bringing this thing up to wide open throttle all the times, there's some things that you have to keep in mind. One of them being, the fact that your bottom end can take this, this type of abuse, for lack of a better word. There's, the basic, bottom end parts, that everyone tends to replace are the rod, flywheel, and people will sometimes put a stroker crank in or leave the stock crank, and they'll a lot of people will kind of pass up on the forged piston because it's to them it's a $200 cost that not necessarily gives them any power. So what I want to talk about today is basically mean piston speed and maximum piston speed, and what those numbers mean to your engine. Now, what those numbers depict is, a mean piston speed and a maximum piston speed. Those are the numbers that are really going to tell you how your engine is going to last under these circumstances if you've built it correctly. Now, we all know that, something that breaks is the cast piston rod. So everyone goes out and the first thing people buy is this cast rod, is this billet rod to replace the cast rod. Now, this is a mandatory part, and this part is necessary if you plan on turning your engine, over 4,000 or 5,000 RPM. This rod's gonna snap, guaranteed. First time you pull the governor and you rip that thing up to 9,000 RPMs, rod's broken. Might last you a day, seriously, a day. If you're actually racing, like say a kart, might make it a lap. This is gonna blow. So you put the billet rod on. Great. So let's see here. Let me see. I wrote down a couple notes for this video, and basically what we're gonna figure out is if in fact you need a billet piston. Now, if I could turn this page here, I happen to take these notes on two separate occasions. So your piston speed. All right, so there's a calculation that you do. There's an equation to find your piston speed, which is stroke times RPM divided by 6. Now, I've done these equations out for, stroker cranks, non-stroker cranks, and most of these numbers here are going to relate to any of the big blocks that have, say a 66 millimeter stroke crank or a 69 millimeter stroke crank. So any of the, the 390, 420, 440s, 460s, all of those engines are going to be grouped under those basically two crank sizes. You're either stroked or you're not stroked. And there's some really information in here that you're probably not going to think that you saw coming. Now, when you're building the bottom end, the need for you know, the billet rod, you can see, because you know it's proven. You know, a lot of people have videos online of these broken piston rods. Now, what's not shown a lot is the broken pistons, and these pistons do break. We've been basically doing some destructive testing lately, which is basically taking engines, strapping them on a dyno under an extreme load, and just running them until they break. And what we've been finding out, that at high RPMs, say, you know, at high RPMs, I'll get into what RPMs and why, that the cast pistons are failing. The cast pistons are failing. So, you know, people will call me with the head, they'll start asking me questions. I say, what RPM are you running? Now, why it's important to know your piston speed is for safe operation. Now, your piston speed, you know, there's a mean piston speed and a maximum piston speed. The maximum piston speed can be, you can kind of go over your maximum piston speed, you know, in short bursts. So from piston types, from weakest to strongest, there's 4 major types of pistons. So you have the cast piston. Above that you have a hypereutectic piston, which is still a cast piston, just made with more silicone. Then you have a forged piston, which is like the billet pistons we run. And then you have the exotic alloy pistons, which are like F1 racing pistons that are just really lightweight, you know, just these crazy alloys. They're not just billet aluminum. So the main two that we use are the cast, which is usually the stock pistons, which is just the lowest of the lows, which is just the stock cast piston, and then a forged piston, which is a really great piston. And do you need to splurge for the forged piston? That's the question we're trying to answer here. Now, I will give you the operating ranges of each one of those pistons. Now, a cast piston is good for a mean piston speed, and this is measured in feet per minute, from 3,000 to 4,000 feet per minute. A forged piston is good from 5,500 to 6,500 feet per minute. So, now, I've done all the equations out here. Now I can show you these equations, and I've actually, the equation is here. Where it says here, mean piston speed, and it's stroke times pi divided by 12 times your RPM, okay? So stroke times pi divided by 12 times RPM, all right? Now, what that means for us, I did all these calculations out for a 460, which is, you know, what I've been basically testing a lot lately. But I've done all the other equations for, so it doesn't matter if it's a 460 or not. We're talking about stroke. There's nothing about bore in this. So there's no piston size, doesn't matter. So the 390, 420, 440, 460, it's all about stroke. If you have a stock crank or if you have a stroker crank. So you're either probably at a 66 or a 69 millimeter stroke. Some of the Honda GX390s I think are 64 millimeter stroke. Hold on, let me get some coffee. So when you talk about this feet per second or feet per minute, so here's the end of the day, the notes on this. So a non-stroker crank. Now, if I've taken the non-stroker crank of 66 millimeters, that's 2.598 inches. Now, if I've taken that and entered this into the equation where it's 2.598 times pi, which is 3.14, divided by 12, times the RPM, so say at I've done 4,000, 6,000, 8,000, and 10,000 RPM equations here. So remember, for a cast piston, it's from 3,000 to 4,000 feet per minute. So at 4,000 RPM on a non-stroker, your mean piston speed is 2,719, which is still good for a cast piston if you wanted to use a cast piston. Now, at 6,000 RPM, which most of you guys are turning your big blocks more than 6,000 RPM, the mean piston speed is 4,078. Now, a cast piston is good from 3,000 to 4,000. So at 6,000 on a non-stroker, you're already 78 feet per minute above what it can take, which is probably fine in short bursts. So if you have a non-stroker with a cast piston on it, that means that for short bursts of time, you can go to 6,000 RPM. All right, now when you get that big block up to 7,000 or 8,000 RPM on a non-stroker, on say a stock engine, stock 420, stock 440, stock 390, if you get those up to into the 8,000 RPM range, your mean piston speed is now 5,438. At 10,000, it's 6,798, which is more than double the maximum piston speed for a cast piston. So a forged piston is good from 5,500 to say 6,500, and at 10,000 RPM on a non-stroker, you're at 6,700 RPM feet per minute. So here's the answer. If you plan on turning your stock big block more than 6,000 RPMs for anything more than a burst, you need to upgrade to a billet piston. If you turn a cast piston under load, an engine that'll free spin to 10,000 RPM. Under load, you're probably not going to get your build to turn 10,000 RPM under load, but 9,000 RPM under load is possible. You know, I'm able to turn 9,000 under load easily. That is going to absolutely destroy a cast piston. You know, it's just going to pop the crown off. You're going to lose the crown to your piston. So here are the mean piston speed calculations over here. This is for the stroker crank. The one on the top is for stroker crank, and the one on the bottom is for the non-stroker crank. So I hope you guys can see those clearly. So if we look here for the stroker crank, you know, at 6,000 RPMs on both of the, at 6,000 on a stroker crank, you're even further. So what it really boils down to, if you put a stroker crank into your big block, you need a forged billet piston. Because after say 5,000 RPM, which everyone's going to turn their engine more than, you're now operating exceedingly above its mean piston speed for a cast piston. So now there's more to it than that. Now I've given you the equations on how to figure it out and whether or not you're going to need it, but let's go more in depth on this situation here. So the types of pistons we've gone over. Another thing that you're going to run into at high piston speeds, and this is another thing that piston speed has to do with, your oiling. Now your oil ring is on the piston. Now you are accelerating this piston from a dead stop at the bottom up to the middle of the stroke where it's at its fastest. You know, the mean piston speed is the average. The maximum piston speed is higher than the mean piston speed because it goes from a stop to its fastest point in the middle, then it starts decelerating to the top where it slows down to a stop again. So it stops, fastest, slowing down, stops. Fastest, slowing down, stops. And it's just doing this exceedingly fast. It's almost like the piston's being shot out of a cannon, 180 times a second. And that puts huge stresses on the motor. A lot of people think that the limiting factors to an engine are valve train. And they'll say, and stabilizing the valve train is huge. And, stabilizing that valve train allows your engine to turn those higher RPMs. But, the absolute the absolute highest stress components in the engine are the piston pin, the rod caps, the bolts, the rod bolts. Those are absolutely the highest stressed parts of the engine, and those are the actual limiting factors. How fast can you move this piston? And horsepower, you know, is a derivative from RPM. So the faster you can move this piston, the more power we can make. So piston speed, in turn, is basically everything. You know, controlling your valve train, getting that, and you know, having a balanced bottom end where you're not sending the vibration, you know, just the crank being out of balance and that vibration. Once you pull that, you know, everyone knows once you pull that balance shaft out, the thing's ripping your teeth out. Well, that, you know, just like any vibration, has a frequency. You know, I do a lot of TIG welding, and TIG welding is all about frequencies, and you know, all these frequencies, they resonate. And you know, when this out of balance of your crankshaft, that goes up the block, and at a certain frequency, that's going to eventually resonate with your valve train. So balancing your bottom end is going to allow your valve train to sustain from flutter or valve float at a higher RPM. So balancing your lower end actually does help you build power. Plus it cuts down on parasitic losses from friction, from the piston, you know, vibrating around and stuff like that. But you know, the stresses that are brought on by this piston speed are insane. I mean, you can't imagine accelerating, you know, this 1 pound mass, which is like, you know, like I said, the equivalent of a cannonball, you know, up to that speed. You know, we're talking feet per second. This is what they feet per minute. I mean, this is what they muzzle velocity, you know. I mean, when we're talking 7,000 feet per minute, you know, this piston is moving, and being able to accelerate that and stop that and bring that back down. Just think about the stresses on the piston and the piston rings. I mean, you know, there's no way those rings aren't going to flutter in there and chatter. I mean, what the goal here is to get the thinnest, lightest piston rings you can. The thinner, the lighter the piston rings, the less likely they're going to be to flutter. And that's why I like those total seal rings. You want the best gapped rings, the lightest rings you can get. These are going to all these things are going to help you build power. And the lighter the piston is, that you know, horsepower equals RPM. You know, it's torque times, you know, 52. So it's like there's a calculation. You know, so I mean, the more RPMs you pull, the more horsepower you're gonna make. So, and the more RPM you make, the more mean piston speed you're creating. So the ability to turn high RPM, you know, it's real. And you know, the real limits of the engine turn out to be your mean piston speed. So, what is that? What do we take from this? Yes, more likely than not, we need a forged piston. If you are thinking about building your block for, you know, longevity, and you want this thing to last, and you've put the money into it, you blow the crown off of a piston, you're starting at scratch. You might salvage an ignition coil, and you know, possibly your exhaust and a carburetor and maybe your flywheel, but more likely than not, everything else in there is getting chucked. You're going to probably break the block, break your rod, break your crank. You know, everything's going to be warped and bent. You're probably going to break your cam. You know, everything's going to come to a crash and halt and just disintegrate the engine in there. You probably, you know, crush all your valves up. You know, that top of the piston is going to pop up there, get rammed up into your head. You know, it's going to destroy the seats, valves, everything. It's just a grenade when that cast piston top blows off. You know, that's worst case scenario. So, you know, so and another thing to think about is oiling. So, like your oil ring, you know, even when it comes to, like, you know, F1 racing engines and Indy cars, you know, these engines are built to sustain insane RPMs. You know, like they'll have like a 1.6 inch stroke. This little tiny stroke with a small piston. And you know why they do that? To keep the piston light, so that they can rev the bejesus out of it. They rev those things to 18 to 20,000 RPMs. Now 18 to 20,000 RPMs on a small block Chevy or one of our engines would just grenade even a billet piston. There's just no way. I mean, and that's another thing, So when it comes to oil, you really want, the right viscosity oil, because after say 8,000 RPM, so my engines, and even this is something that this testing has taught me. I'm a big believer in high horsepower. You're gonna call me and you're gonna recommend for me what you want, unless you specifically know I'm gonna be building you basically a high horsepower engine that's just meant to rev to the moon. And if money's no object, I'll give you just that. But what it comes down to is, after 8,000, say RPM, or over 8,000 RPM, what becomes a real problem for splash lubricated engines is just oiling. The only thing we have oiling in our engines is this little pin right here, and this what it can flip up during that splashing. So this thing is 8,000 RPMs and it's splashing oil. Now you have a big piston, and you're relying on just this little tiny splash to coat that entire piston cylinder, continuously at, all these times a second, and for it to not get completely wiped off. So a great oil, something with the right viscosity based for your piston, that's all things that you need to find out for yourself. What viscosity, that's based on your clearances, personal preference, weather, temperature your engine's running at, stuff like that, RPMs that your engine's gonna be running, but running the right oil, the right viscosity, and in any engines that are built for racing, for cars, that sustain these RPMs over 8,000, like NASCAR and Indy and stuff like that, they have oil injectors that spray that oil. We don't have that. So turning our engines like mine 10,500 RPMs, just insane. For that entire pull, or that entire, for that last 2 seconds of the track, or that last 3 seconds of dyno pull, or 4 seconds or 5 seconds of dyno pull, that engine has no oil on the rings, or not enough to satisfy it, which is just about like having no oil on your rings, and it's just gonna burn them up. They're gonna glow. So make sure you got the right oil, the right clearances, everything's set in there. And so then there's other things like, calculating your piston limits, and that has to do with piston speed and stuff like that. That's for another video. But this is just, to clear up a lot of things. A lot of people have been asking me if in fact they do need a billet piston, and the answer most likely is yes, if you plan on, if you're making real horsepower, or if it doesn't even really matter about the horsepower. If you're turning it, the RPMs, over 6,000 RPM in a big block, if you plan on, if you ride this thing on the street, or if you're putting this on a kart motor, and you're going to be at 6,000 RPM, riding down the street, and you're just trying to keep up with traffic that's going 50 miles an hour, so you're just all out flooring it, you need a billet piston. To hold it that far beyond its, it's the material's operating range of a cast piston, you're just asking for trouble. So a lot of the guys that are road racers and stuff like that just like riding these things at wide open throttle, and especially in the big blocks on a cast piston, I would be very wary of it, especially if you have money invested in that engine. Spend the extra 150 to 200 bucks, get yourself a billet piston, really make that bottom end bulletproof, and go from there. As far as that's concerned, I feel like that's pretty well talked about. I do support these videos through the funds that have been coming in through doing the heads and stuff like that. So let's just take a second to talk about that. If you want to send me a head, give me a call, send me a text, whatever you want to do. you know, I'm always answering the phone, even if it's up till like 8:30 at night. Try not to call me past 9. I'd appreciate that, but if you have to, you have to. Emergencies, I'm always there. But, you know, brand new heads are always better than used head. If in fact there's a situation where you've got a head, you've already had work done to it, like valve seats or something like that, and you need something else done, you know, we'll try to talk it out and work it out. Had even a call today, a guy looking for a small block engine to get welded up. You know, by the time, and he wanted to get it bored and sleeved. And this is what I tell people all the time. By the time you're done with the small block engine, you've bored it, you've sleeved it, you got a weaker block overall. You've taken out a lot of the casting. You've now disturbed it, distorted it. It's had stresses in it. You don't know. It could have microscopic stress cracks. Start with a big block. Save the money. You know, if he was talking about a gx200, you know, the engine's $350 maybe. I'm not sure. I've never bought a brand new gx200. You know, $350. By the time you're boring it and sleeving it, you buy the bore, you buy the sleeve, then you got to buy the special Wiseco piston and this and that. Just buy a big block. You know, put a standard rod in there, buy a billet piston for that. By the time you're done, you're buying more just off the stock shelf parts, and you've got a much bigger starter engine that, you know, there's no replacement for displacement. You know, that bottom end with the big 10-bolt side cover is going to be a lot stronger and need a lot less, you know, maintenance and repairs. It's just going to last longer between, you know, total breakdowns. You know, the 212s and stuff like that, I've built them in the past. I still will build them. But, you know, if you want to dump that kind of, first of all, I don't bore and sleeve engines. So if you're looking to bore and sleeve, I don't do that. Mostly what I do is performance cylinder heads. I'll assemble an engine for you, properly clearance everything, you know, depending upon what you want to do. But, you know, don't call me, you know, tell me you got $1,000 and you want to buy this engine. You know, it's not going to happen. You know, I probably have $2,500 in parts into that engine, and I built it myself. That engine's probably worth $5,000, which is unattainable. So, you know, I mean, that's what it costs to build, you know, say like a, you know, a really high performance engine. So I mean, you know, if you got $1,000 and you want to build an engine, that might just get you the parts, you know, and then if you want someone to build it, it's going to cost, you know, whatever it's going to cost to assemble it, depending upon what you want done. But you know, you'd be better off taking that $1,000 and putting, you know, a good chunk of that towards a cylinder head, and then, you know, the rest of the engine, build it yourself. That's the smartest way, you know. Put the money into the cylinder head, get the power. The rest of that stuff you can do yourself, unless you're at like a, you know, a level of competition that, you know, most guys are, you know, having their engines built. That's when we can talk about assembling an engine. But for the normal guy that's just out mini bike racing, try to build the engine yourself. Come to me for a cylinder head. If you want me to build your block, weld your block, you know, clearance it, line hone it, all that stuff, you know, bore it out, besides the boring, but I can hone it out for you. I can put in a 10,000th oversized piston. I'm not going to bore and sleeve an engine, but, you know, those videos help pay, those sales help pay for these videos. Another thing, a lot of people have been calling me for Duramax pots. As you guys know, if you've called me, you know I always, you know, try to lead people to Duramax. You know, when Predator 212s came on the scene, they were just the beast. They were giving them out cheap, and they were a board stroked version of the gx200. So everyone went Predator 212. Well, you know, the gx390 came out, then it was the Predator 420. Well, the Duramax came out and said, hey, here's our 440. So this thing already has a 92 millimeter bore in it. You know, you put a stroker crank on it, and you don't even have to mess with the stock casting in any way. So you can still have a pretty strong block, and you could put a stroker crank in it, and you could bring it up to a 460 for relatively inexpensive money. And then you can, you know, put your rod, put your flywheel on that, put your piston in that, you know, and then that gives you that great bottom end. And then you go out and then you get a head for that. You know, call me for a head for that. And that's where you'll start kicking some ass and taking some names. Unless you're going into racing somebody else that going on my cylinder heads, then you can have a problem. It's going to be all about tuning at that point. And I can't help you tune. I can try to help you tune it, but to really tune these things, you need to get someone that either one knows how to tune it, or two, If you live locally, I can help you. You know that. But you're gonna need to tune these things. Get your carburetor tuned correctly. Get the right exhaust. You know, whenever I build a engine for you guys, you know, I help you guys select the cams and stuff like that. So we'll make sure it has the right cam to the right size valves, to the right port, to the right carb. I'll line that stuff up for you. But you know, tuning it, what size gearing you're gonna run, you know, what you're running for 8th mile times, you know, should you be running a torque converter, should you be running a clutch, what size tires you should have, you know, how much the driver should weigh. That stuff's on you guys. So you know, this stuff's all good fun. And you know, I'll put these videos out, you know, hopefully, you know, watch some videos, chop it up, learn something. But hope you guys had fun. Another video, how to you know, pick your, do you need a cast piston? What's the answer? Most likely yes. But you know, it's Boston, we got our jackets on, it's already cold outside, snowed about 4 or 5 times already. But I'm Paul from Paul's Karts. My number is 781-492-7358. You guys need anything, and as always, thank you for watching. You guys have a happy holiday.